right. I am here with Jeff Chow, CEO of Invision. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks so much, Eric.
It's great to meet you. I've been using Invision for many, many years in my work. It is almost sort of a required tool in my coaching and my product and executive coaching to help companies get to product market fit faster, essentially. So I'm really happy to talk to you about what you're doing at Invision. Before we get there, I'd love to learn a little bit about you. So tell me about your background and kind of what led you to become the CEO of Invision.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me on the show. Really excited to share my own journey and obviously a ton about why that's relevant with Invision as well. I would characterize my entire journey as my parents set me up on the very traditional path, and then I took every atypical zig and zag turn along the way. So, they were the immigrants who wanted me to either be an engineer or a doctor, put me on the honors path, and then I went to MIT, right? And so, but I was probably the worst student at MIT. I would not go so far. Any prerequisite like freshman bio or other things, I would literally fail the class. I couldn't do it. And then so I would have these kind of polarizing moments where I would either be the worst student in the class, or I would be like the professor's dream. I would get the like A++ on everything. And it really turned out that I had to do a lot of introspection, which honestly, this is all me looking back at it, is where would I get my energy from? And it turns out it was two things. One was creative problem solving, and the second thing was team dynamics. And so like if it were a class that involved team projects, we would crush it, right? And I would lead the team and I would do it and I wouldn't want to let my team down. If it had anything to do with creativity or creative problem solving or anything that wasn't necessarily rote or academic, I would be super energized. I'd be very passionate about it. And I think that was sort of really the basis for a little bit of the entrepreneurial spirit, a lot of the things that maybe today people would be able to codify, but back in the late 90s, it wasn't actually all there. So, right out of the gates, started being entrepreneurial, right? I joined really quickly a startup during the dot-com boom, slash bust, decided to found a company in January 2000. And which is, I call that my bootstrapped business school. So I didn't go to business school, but really quickly we had to go from, it's easy to raise a ton of money to like, okay, how do we hustle to actually build this business on nothing, right? So it was an email marketing startup originally intended for small, medium-sized businesses, but we pivoted really quickly to agencies. And back in the day, this is us putting servers into the server racks ourselves and things like that. So, my journey was first entrepreneurial. I founded 3 companies: marketing automation, mobile advertising, and then consumer space. Was lucky enough to be able to exit all 3 of them. And then the last one, our consumer app, we sold to Google. And then that's where I really got a taste of the scaled world, right? This is where it's like, okay, I went from maybe 5 million users to 100 million users to 1 billion users, and really understanding how to kind of scale that practice. Ultimately moved on to working at TripAdvisor to lead the product and product design discipline for the main TripAdvisor.com site, and then ultimately found my way to Invision.
Wow! And so you've had a long experience in product management. So obviously bringing in that creative expertise, but this is an area where I think that the industry hasn't really evolved or matured yet in terms of like really what is the role of the product manager, right? What does that product leadership mean? It comes in all different flavors. So what kind of product manager would you say you are?
Yeah, I think over time I've, back to when it was, back in the late 90s, there really wasn't even the sense of a product manager, right? It was like some marketing versus engineering. And there's a sort of this kind of gap and void. And ultimately, I look at product management as 3 things, right? Problem solvers, pace setters, and communicators, right? You're generally not you don't have a giant team under you, right? You don't, you're not really, you don't have engineering or design reporting to you. You're sort of you're trying to like really set the playbook and setting the whys and the whats and making sure that everyone gets it. And so that sort of balance has always been how I've tried to mentor a lot of product leaders, is around hey, how do you actually express the whys and the whats? How do you motivate people to understand what problems they're trying to solve? And how do you actually get the best out of people? So it's less about there are some product leaders who are command and control. It's like, I have a vision, I have an idea, I just need you to execute. And I've made that mistake myself, but ultimately I think it's really about getting teams to really own the problem to solve, and then kind of magic happens, right? And so my happiest moments of my career has usually been around one day having sort of an entry-level engineer coming in with the idea that unlocks a problem, right? Because that means I've done my job in terms of expressing the problem statements to solve and inspiring them to try to figure it out themselves, as opposed to just taking the next ticket off of Jira, right? And so like those are the kind of the key areas that I would say, is my style.
So that experience leading those class projects really worked out for you, right? Leading without authority.
At least that's what I say, just in terms of for my parents, just so that I could tell them that they didn't waste all their money on my college.
It was
my
useful.
college.
Yeah. So I'm a coach myself. I've coached sort of startup founders and product leaders for many years, and what I find is that a lot of product managers are sort of product doers, right? They feel like they have all this responsibility on their shoulders. They have to engage with the customers. They have to design the solution. They have to understand the problem. They have to understand the competition and the market. And we got to sit there in the sprints and be the project manager. And they got to get up and build slide decks and talk, it's crazy the amount of burden that they tend to take on themselves. And I call it feeding the beast.
Yep.
Right. That especially in fast growing startups where they tend to hire engineering heavy, as you mentioned, right? The product team tends to be small, even anemic compared to the size of these engineering orgs. And so I say it's a product manager. It's in the title.
Yeah.
It's a leadership role. You're not meant to do all of these things yourself, and you're probably not even good at it. And so how do you lead and influence, again, without authority, right? Because you're not on top of all of this. But so that really is, I think, the secret sauce of a good product manager is that ability to, again, influence and persuade and communicate, again, without a command and control kind of model.
100%. And I think it's a lot of, I hate the term soft skills, but when you're a problem solver, you do try to figure out what's the best way. And I would say of those, juggling all of those levers, the people problem solving is probably the one that is least matured, right? Depending on who you are, I mix all my metaphors, but depending on who you are, if you're a sports fan, I'm like, listen, I'm from Boston, right? So like Bill Belichick, right? Like he has to sit there and figure out offensive line, the quarterback, the wide receivers, what's the chemistry? Do you need, if you have, same thing. If you're into music, like if you're a conductor, you have to figure out if this is what song you're trying to play, what's the right mix of people, and it's the chemistry. And I find the strongest product leaders are the ones who really get team chemistry, and they can be like, okay, there's that one diva engineer, and that diva engineer is going to do the 100x. But generally, they get very fatigued when they actually have to do the last mile of shipping, right? Then there's like the steady person that's just like, I will just confidently deliver what is asked and things like that. To make magic happen, you need to kind of pull them all together and find the right chemistry to do that, right? And I think that's generally, and then all of a sudden it's like, okay, that creative diva engineer is actually solving a lot of the things that didn't have to be a 5-page product brief, right? But then like delivering it on time and on budget, is they can take that idea and now 5 more engineers are actually going to execute the last mile. And that's when I see like that huge chemistry is the giant unlock, And now at Invision, we're doing it at like a massive scale, both for business success as well, as CEO, but ultimately they're the same patterns, right? From like heading up product or leading the company that I find kind of true.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that. I do mention that, or I do often say that the hard skill of a product manager is empathy, which is kind
Yeah.
of funny because it seems like it's a soft skill, but it is the most practical and necessary skill. Not only empathy with relation to the customers, but empathy with relation to the team as well. Right?
Yeah.
That's how you become an effective leader, is this functional, practical empathy.
Yeah.
Um,
In the remote world, things that used to come very natural in office, right? You can see
mhm,
body language. You can
mhm,
see sort of like offline body language. And then generally, I would say most good product leaders would be able to just be like, oh, maybe I should pull that guy aside or girl aside and go get coffee, or just say like, how are you doing? Right. And just like sit next
mhm.
to their desk. Um, you got to be much more intentional about it now, right? When you're a
Yeah.
little bit more hybrid or remote. And I find that is the really great product leaders have this amazing intuition and are not afraid to have like the one-on-one, right?
Mhm.
And the heart-to-heart. Honestly, like be able to be less transactional and have that level of empathy and understanding, and almost like the I see you.
Yeah.
This is,
Yeah.
yeah, that's a challenge, or wow, we just pulled that rug from under you, or whatever. And it really does unlock an amazing amount of like, what are people going through, or you assume the positive around all these things. And yeah, you're right.
Mhm.
I mean, I do find that is probably one of the number one traits of great leaders, that aren't just I'm just going to jam this project through no matter what.
So I'm really interested. So, coming to the role, obviously you have an entrepreneurial background or founder background, but stepping into the role of CEO at Invision by way of chief product officer was really intriguing to me, because I'm always coaching founders who may come from maybe more of a sales or marketing background to do more sort of product thinking,
Yeah.
and even just having more empathy with engineering. And so I'm kind of wondering, what's your approach to the role of the CEO that might be different or unique, in your own words?
Yeah, um, I'm fortunate enough to have found Envision in a way that, if you think about what we do, we're sort of a visual collaboration platform that unlocks productivity for cross-functional teams, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you really think about product management, it's how do you make the most out of cross-functional teams to
Mm-hmm.
produce magic. So, you know, I wouldn't say that, the classic path of product to CEO is always true. I wouldn't say that if a supply chain level company, or one that isn't just pure software, but at Envision, everything that my career has built around building the muscle around team dynamics and structure is actually what the product is supposed to do. So there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of real applicability. Clark, our founder, who is the previous CEO, was also very product-led
Mm-hmm.
CEO. So, in terms of both succession planning, or just being able to have that understanding, and then the board understanding that, like, hey, this, as a SaaS business, this specific one needs that product leadership above all
Mm-hmm.
else, but then surround that product leadership with the right go-to-market muscles, the right others. And so, where I've taken that is looking at Invision, and then specifically Freehand, which is our growth product right now, is really focusing on both not letting go of the product, right,
Mm-hmm.
aspect. Product is driving the business. We are, by putting myself in the CEO position, we are really putting a stake in the ground, saying like, we believe the product is going to grow the business, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really key. But then surrounding myself with really amazing leaders, right? And so this is our COO, our chief commercial officer. These are amazing leaders who have muscles at scaling, who are supporting things that, back to energy forces. I know where my energy is gained, and I know where my energy is depleted. And part of my job, back to team chemistry, is to surround myself with the people who are going to do the things that energizes them and depletes me, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so I really do think that is the right area and the right direction. And, our industry, collaboration in general, and just like the workplace right now, is one that we are not at an optimization phase, right? Like, I would say that a classic startup path is, you find the product market fit, you scale it, the inventors kind of get bored and they leave, and then now you have like the optimizers because now the business is on rails and you're sort of going there. We are in an interesting inflection point where we actually have to invent our way, to the next level, right? And I think that's both what's happening with AI, what's happening with collaboration, what's happening with, even the economy with the, tool sprawl and budgets. There's just so much going on that I think there's both a glass half full take, which is this is the opportunity. We have to capture it, but we have to keep being entrepreneurial to find that next step function growth. Or it's pessimistic, which is like you have to innovate or you're gonna die. So either way, I think that's generally where we are.
Yeah. So, obviously as a champion of product-led growth, not only internally, but also enabling companies to do product-led growth better than any other tool that I can think of off the top of my head. This is a topic that gets debated a lot. Product-led growth it's a buzzword. It's something that someone comes in and champions, and it may or may not go over well, and you might get a lot of resistance, especially from the other departments that have typically been leading growth. What's your philosophy on product-led growth and the power that it has?
Yeah, it's interesting because throughout my career, there's always been these kind of terminologies that have rang true, and then when you think about solving problems, they tend to get a little bit too rigid, right? So I would say I use product-led growth flexibly, really more saying like in a tool like a collaboration tool. Generally, there's a set of people who aren't going to talk directly with a salesperson first. They're going to try it, right? And they're going to use it. And what happens is that then it can really go into an organization. And when you do have larger enterprise opportunities, you have the endorsers being the users, the employees of a company, really there to make the job easier to kind of sell through. I think the more rigid product-led growth is like self-serve to pro, funnel optimization. Are you doing free trial or freemium and things like that? And I think that's back to like everyone has a bunch of tools in their tool belt. That's one technique. I believe that Invision has kind of perfected the enterprise product variant of product-led growth, right? It's the understanding that departments in an enterprise are going to use it, and you want to remove the friction for the adoption to happen, but it has to be balanced with a strong enterprise sales team, strong customer success team, strong, people who are there to really understand like what is the impulse of a central buyer, right? The impulse of a central buyer is not to let a SaaS tool run free in an organization. Is to understand what the value is there truly ROI and all these other things. And that's not something that you can do either through just organic bottoms up approaches and others. So we do use product-led growth maniacally as a term internally, but probably not necessarily as like, we are top of funnel to, self-service and others. It's much more, our variant is much more focused on large enterprise opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the misunderstanding that I tend to see the most is, as you mentioned, people seeing it just as like a pricing model, right? That product-led growth is really just about freemium, and it's not. It's about customer experience. They focus on the customer and a focus on creating a great customer experience, which will create products that sell themselves and with incredible retention and referrals and so on and so forth. That becomes the driver for growth. And so I've actually sort of evolved the term a little bit, and I call it customer-led growth or discovery-led growth, but I'm basically really bullish on the research side of things because I see that if we understand our customers really well, if we understand their problems and how they manifest and how they're trying to solve them and how they're failing to solve them, and we create a solution and then validate it early and often and in many different ways and through many different lenses, we can create product market fit and we can create product-led growth that is effortless sales. Right?
Yes, 100%. That's amazing. And again, I think that makes a ton of sense in terms of, the other fun catchphrase is continuous improvement, right? It's the constant iteration, validation,
exactly,
ideation to, And if you find yourself in that loop and you're taking the customer feedback and then solving the problem either directly or through an abstracted way, then yeah, like I think the value really kind of resonates, and then it starts selling itself for sure.
Yeah. So it's funny you mentioned that. So like my background is in engineering, and I've been an agile evangelist
Yeah.
for like almost 20 years now. I used to work in big tech companies that were all waterfall and old school and everything. And I stumbled on this dusty little, Bible called the Agile Manifesto, and just tried to drive change in these big organizations to be agile, but from a principled standpoint, not so much Scrum. So Scrum comes
Yep.
to play, and everyone says, "Oh, this is great. Let's take this waterfall project and chop it up into 2-week sprints." And well, we all know kind of the problems that come out of that. And so I actually, some of my first work in coaching was being an agile coach.
Mhm.
And I have all these talks, and I wrote a book and all this kind of stuff around how to be truly agile, and not agile with a capital A T
Yep.
M,
Yep. Yep.
off the shelf. But there was an epiphany that I had, which was that even in the companies that had incredibly agile engineering teams, the biggest problem that they would face was that the rest of the business wasn't agile. That you would have
That's right.
waterfall up top, and then it would drop into this engineering team that would try to spin on it, but obviously they're being driven in this waterfall mode. And so my next phase of evangelism was evangelizing agile principles in product
Yeah.
and moving that upstream. And so this is where continuous discovery-led growth, product-led growth, all these sorts of things, and that's where Invision really came to play,
Yeah.
where the product teams would say, well, we've got to go do our research, and we've got to come up with designs, and we've got to design these really high fidelity mock-ups, and then we're going to deliver all that to you. And then, you tell me you can do it in a sprint, but I don't want what you can give me in a sprint. I want the whole big thing that I gave you, right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
want the
Yeah.
finished design. So in comes Invision and allows us to take some drawings or mock-ups, or, at various levels of fidelity, and within, a few hours, have something that we can go put in front of customers and get feedback. And then we go and we do that, and we get some feedback, and we say, oh, we need to tweak some things. Well, I can like literally scribble something out and redraw something, or I can do my junky
Yep.
Photoshop job and swap some things around, copy and paste, and say, okay, go do it again. And the speed of insight that we were able to get with your tool was just phenomenal. And one of the few things that really set the light bulb off
Yeah.
with these companies, right? And to show them, like, this is what we've been trying to do for so long in the engineering space. This is what it looks like. This is the power of agile in a product context. So again, that's where how I found you, really, is
Yeah.
that this has just been this incredible tool for unlocking speed and unlocking clarity and unlocking empathy in product teams. So obviously, bravo, to you guys for doing that. But again, I'd love to hear kind of your take on it and how you see, the impact in the market and beyond.
It's so great to hear that example, and honestly, the ideas of agile being kind of siloed in a world of waterfall. We've been obsessing over this problem for a very long time, right? And it started in the design field, or just kind of the visual field of, hey, if we're building product, what's the best way to make it kind of both teams working together, right? It used to be like your designer was kind of saying, hey, let me do my designs, and they would even shun the product manager, especially when they started wireframing, because they're like, dude, stay in your lane, stuff like that. But ultimately we were pushing on this idea of like, no, it's called visual collaboration. How would you articulate an idea? And what a lot of people really kind of intuitively understand, but some don't, is that most people can't talk in the right kind of syntax to get heard, right? You have to sort of say like, and that's why visual is really helpful, right? And sometimes the visual is like a very prescriptive thing, but then ultimately teams working together, you can abstract the whys and the whats from the how, and ultimately you're back on the road. And so, prototypes was our first product, and it was a massive unlock around all right, before anything's built or before there's like final design, right? There's a real psychological barrier when there's a very high sheen design, because then people don't give the right feedback. They're like, oh my God, this person probably spent hours building this. I can't give the right feedback because I feel bad, right?
Yeah.
And so, wireframing or building like lo-fi mock-ups and then ultimately prototypes were amazing ways of just validating some like really quick ideas before it went too far, and then constantly iterating. We, over time, had a fork in the road. We had to decide, right? And we had to decide, okay, are we going to actually pick the lane, which is to go deeper towards design? So design tooling like a Figma and really the expertise of design, or are we actually going to delve even deeper into what's truly unlocking cross-functional teams to do their work better? And it was and I'll be honest, we kind of chose both paths for a while. And we had to get to this existential moment, which is saying like, okay, what is the true DNA of the company, right? And a lot of our decision kind of netted out to say like, no, the passion, the energy, what actually gets us up in the morning, what makes us feel really happy is when we actually unlock the power of the cross-functional team. How could we get an entire organization to think like a really high-functioning agile product team? And because if you think about it, if you're building a corporate OKR, if you're doing a sales plan, if you're doing, a recruiting pipeline, it's all the same thing as building a product, which is you have to do your planning and your messy work where you're brainstorming and you're trying to figure out, and there are a bunch of people in it. Then you need to, synthesize that to like, here's our execution strategy. Then you execute. Then you learn a little bit more about, what's working, what's not. Then you go back to the planning because you've learned some insights that you have to make some tweaks, and so on and so forth. That's the continuous improvement. And so that's, so we launched maybe 3 or 4 years ago a product called Freehand. And originally started as a digital whiteboard, right? And it was intentionally supposed to be super simple. But what we really found, especially through the pandemic, was organizations outside of EPD were starting to use it, and they were using it in the way that you would expect, a really highly matured agile team to be doing it, right? They were using it as an inclusive space to do the messy work, but then they were distilling it to be like, okay, this is how I want to get validation. They would present it, get feedback, do some more, and keep iterating. And, and that's where we've really built our muscle to say like, actually, our mission is to help teams do their best work together for the full organization, right? And so today we have, thousands of enterprise customers across all functions, building, doing projects, really unlocking cross-functional behaviors. And again, through the things that were a little bit lazy when you're in person, now that people are more hybrid, like meetings or others, now, synchronous and asynchronous work is making it, it's really helping organizations really improve their productivity. So everything you talked about around agile practices, and frankly, the capital A agile is scary for non-engineering, people to say like, okay, you don't need a term. You're actually doing it already. You're actually working together, being mindful of signals that you're getting back and iterating as you go along. It's not waterfall, right? Congratulations. So unlocking that cross-functional behavior is really our reason for being.
Yeah. At the end of the day, it's all about feedback loops, right?
Yep.
We're just trying to get feedback, and we're trying to, not spend too much time working on something that hasn't been tested or validated. So actually, one of the biggest unlocks that I tend to see in my teams, and certainly in my own experience, but with the companies I work with, is when they get in these really low level debates about minutia, right? About, well, how would the customer react to this, and what would they think, and would they act this way? All of these hypothetical scenarios. And it's like, dude, just go test it, right? Let's maybe make a couple of versions and go put it in front of them, or maybe let's just go ask them. And what I find is that really waterfall, in essence, it's fear of failure manifested in this system, this way of working, that we have to be perfect before we go to market. Everything has to be just right. And what we find is that when we lose that feedback loop and lose that empathy, it ends up falling flat. So we fail in a big way as opposed to failing in a little way. And so what I try to coach along this is all about feedback loops, and it's all about experimentation. So if we can use the low fidelity, the gray wireframes and so on, I don't have as much fear of failure because the stakes are low. Hey, this is just a sketch. Like I'm not, my heart and soul hasn't been put into this. You're not going to insult my baby here. I'm just trying to get some feedback. And if you can start at that point and change that mindset, then all of a sudden, again, it just becomes this amazing this blossoming and self-reinforcing feedback loop where you are co-creating the optimal solution with your customer. Now, again, I'm going down a product lane again, but this is in strategy, this is in marketing, this is in sales, in every aspect of the business. What we need feedback loops, we need to learn quickly, and we need to eliminate our fear of failure so that we can ultimately take risks. And that is what innovation is in a nutshell.
Do you know what's fascinating about that is that when it works, and it's amazing when it works, but what's the coolest thing about it is that you're actually then going back to instinct and intuition. Yeah. Because these loops are so fast, and that it's not in change management, when you encounter a team that like thinks that they're agile, but they're actually waterfall, you have a lot of like, well, are we sure about that? Like, are we sure the team needs the internet? Do they really want the internet? And you're like, what are you doing? You're like, yes, we want the internet. Like this is not, why are you trying to validate that? But if you can actually unpack that, then all of a sudden people quietly are like, you know what? I think the solution is just this, like you bypass the process and you bypass other things because you could actually just try it. And if it falls flat, that's okay. But then you learn something. You actually get the signal once you try it. And then it feeds back, and then you're back at it, right? Like you're back at this rhythm. And I think that's amazing because, sometimes, and back your question about my leadership style is, sometimes I find it fascinating, and I have the luxury of sitting a little bit further away from like the deep work now so that I can like fresh set of eyes be like, you guys just bypassed all the logic to then like out-process yourself, and now you're completely in a Gordian knot. You're like, you can't untangle yourself. Yeah. If you just 3 weeks ago, in your discovery phase, just said, hey, this is my strongly held belief, and let's kind of run that down, and if it falls off track, that's okay, because you knew that there was a support system that would help you iterate and fail safely, we would be 10 miles further down the road at this point. And I think those are, and it's based on logic, right? Some of the brightest minds have the pattern recognition, the experience, or just the human insight that can create real magical things just by intuition, right? And I think that's a powerful tool itself.
And it's one of those things, you just can't tell people with words. They have to just experience it for themselves.
That's right.
So my number one task as I get in there is like, just try it. I'm just going to take you along, So actually I run a startup accelerator as well for early growth stage companies. And sort of step 3 in our onboarding process is around prototyping, and we recommend your tool. And we have these challenges, which is like, you have to take the thing that you believe the most strongly and try to go invalidate it using some sort of feedback loop or prototyping tool. And it's one of these things where it's like, we abstract things a little bit, right? Yeah. To just say, just go do it, just go get the motion a little bit, and then we'll come back and we'll do it for real, right? But just to get people to go talk to 10 customers and put themselves out of their comfort zone and come up with something like, you only have one day to come up with a prototype and you have to go test it right away because I don't want you spending too much time making it too good, Yeah.
Exactly.
Even something crazy like you're going to do something on paper, but you have to draw it with your non-dominant hand.
100%.
Just trying to trick people.
The time constraint is probably the most important lever, right? Yeah. Because I think there's cutting my teeth and making this mistake myself in product is you do convince yourself that like some feature is such the no-brainer feature, and then it's like, okay, if you just put it in front of a customer, even in its current form, and you listen, like it's going to the dentist, but it's painful, but like you listen to them, you'll realize 5 minutes before you thought, your hill to die on feature improvement that was a blocker to launching anything was number 1 on the list. It is now actually number 25 on the list.
Yeah.
Right. And the amazing shift in like that understanding and sometimes it's so subconscious, but like 5 minutes after the user interview and watching it, your same amount of conviction that like, that number 1 feature should be 1 and now it's 25. You have that same amount of conviction. You're like, oh yeah, that feature, that's not important. That's number 25. You're like, did you hear yourself 30 minutes ago? And it's just, it's the data and the thirst for the data, be it qual quant, is so important.
Yeah. So so earlier on, we get into customer and product or customer and problem interviews, right? Before we get into a solution. And I say, okay, everyone has to go do these interviews in pairs and you have to have a swear jar. And every time you mention your product, you got to put $1 in the swear jar, right?
I love
Just shut up and listen.
Listen, that's right.
And if you just listen to them, they will tell you what their problems are, and they'll describe. You'll see it in their verbal and nonverbal language how passionate they get about certain things.
That's right.
Whereas if you get in and you start to say, "Well, I have this feature. What do you think of this feature?" As you said before, they're probably going to say, "Well, yeah, that's really great. Yeah, no, totally. You obviously put so much work into that, and I want to please you, and I don't want to make you upset, so I'm going to tell you, yes, go build that thing." Right?
Yeah.
But if you actually just talk to people about their problems, they're probably going to go off in a completely different direction, right?
The interesting part about that framework too is that, there's like feature development, some UX, and then there's also invention, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hearing somebody's problem and then presenting to them something that they didn't literally ask for, but it actually solves their problem, is a very interesting kind of similar aspect, which is, we recently introduced this innovation on Freehand, which is really kind of incorporating project management onto the canvas, right? So like traditionally you would think of digital whiteboarding as just like messy brainstorm. And then like you'd go to some other place like an Asana or other places for like the structured project planning. And we said, you know what, we want to infuse this all together. We actually had some customer feedback along those lines, but it wasn't like, hey, I'd really love for you guys to add another tool into your canvas to, blah, blah, blah. It was more like, hey, we're doing all this brainstorm work, and then it's really hard to then transition to like when we're ready to execute. It feels like everything's here, and then we scatter like, like a kid's soccer game, and so, and we're like, oh, okay. And so, I think that was one of those things where it's like even the headier, hey, let's get to where the puck is going. The customers might not be asking for it. You're right. Putting it in front of a customer and we just showed them, hey, these are the kind of the early lo-fi concepts of what we're trying to do. And they're like, oh my God, I need this. Right? Like I didn't realize this was the broken element of our process, but actually this is the broken element of our process. We would do all this really engaging stuff over here, and then the Scrum Master would share their screen, and we're all dead in our eyes watching somebody update Jira. It's like, it's like, oh, I didn't know to ask for that, but like, thank you. This is going to save us so much time. And I think those are that's the next level aspect of it's the exact same framework you're talking about. It's just that you can use it for optimization. You can use it for like massive invention. You can use it for different things, but it's always the same rhythm, right? Which is like problem, solution. The solution just can be crazy. It could be, not crazy at all. And then validation, and then rinse, repeat.
So what does your vision look like? What does the team of the future or the company of the future look like when, your vision is fully baked?
Yeah. What we believe very strongly is there needs to be a collaborative workspace that is purpose-built for cross-functional teams. And that has to include every step in a business process. Because if you think about it, the entire life of SaaS tools, especially in workplace productivity, kind of started in functional silos first, right? You built you solved the jobs to be done problem. You're like, oh, I'm a designer, therefore I must have a tool to design. Oh, I'm an engineering leader. I must have a tool to track my burn down and velocity. Oh, I'm a sales leader. I need to track, all these things. And so by solving the jobs to be done first, you've created these kind of silos, and these silos now have their own micro SaaS tools. And now all of a sudden there's just this huge fragmentation, which makes it impossible for cross-functional teams to work. And so, and now add the economic realities, and every organization is now looking at their SaaS sprawl and saying like, oh my God, why do we have 5 different note-taking apps, 4 different task tracking apps, 3 different, icebreaker apps and things like that. And so, our belief is there's a real opportunity here to say, actually, if you think about it, when cross-functional teams meet first to then figure out what to sell, how to sell, what to build, and things like that, it's cross-functional. And if they are able to kind of solve the problem together first, then everything else falls from it. So, our belief is that there needs to be a cross-functional collaborative workspace that is the center of everything. It needs to deeply integrate with, all the functional tools in a deep way. And it needs to service both the planning, the execution, and the tracking of all those tools. And then most core is the synthesis. Right, the synthesis is the difference, is the intersection between unstructured and structured work. Right, it's when you're saying like, okay, of all these brainstorm ideas, what are we going to build? Synthesis. Right, okay, what we just launched, is it working or not? Here's all the data. Synthesis. How do you synthesize the problem to solve? Again, back into it. So like this virtual cycle should not be 8 different tools. It should just be one tool that a team, and that then unlocks what we're just talking about. Right, all that continuous improvement. The biggest thing in the way of continuous improvement, continuous cycles, is tool fragmentation. You can't be continuous if you're leapfrogging 8 different tools all the time, right? And so that's really the key, And the final thing is, our belief it should be on the canvas. For anyone who's worked on, a freehand, a mural, the real-time multiplayer canvas, it actually has this amazing quality of being inclusive. So everybody feels like they're a creator. They're not a second-class citizen. It's spatial. It's tactile. So it feels a little bit more visual. And the infinite canvas gives you a lot of flexibility. So, we're building a lot on top of the canvas to like move well beyond the whiteboard, but in a place where cross-functional teams can really get their work done.
That's really interesting. So, I in my career, I started in big tech, big enterprise, moved into the startup world. And as a coach and as a consultant, I would get brought into enterprises again, and they would always ask me, how do we get that startup magic again, right? How do we become more like a startup, or we want to act more like a startup? And the number one thing we'd always get to is it's the silo problem.
Yeah.
That's the thing. That is when we talk about the startup magic, it's when you've got a team of 6 people in an office together, they are constantly engaging, constantly talking, constantly giving feedback from different perspectives, and they're looking at the business and the product as one thing.
Yep.
And then as it grows, it starts to fragment, it starts to silo. And now you have committees, and now you have approvals and change management processes and so on and so forth. So, okay, we got to bring people together, create cross-functional teams and communicate and collaborate and create, empathy.
Yeah.
But then what the other thing too is then going back into startups is realizing or learning how early or how quickly those silos start to happen. And it's basically like the two pizza problem, right? Once you get above a team of say 10 or 15 people, you start to get fragmentation, and the fragmentation tends to go along those functional lines. So it's well, how can we hang on to this magic as long as possible? So it's coming at it from both ends. But so I think ultimately, right, what you're doing here, delivering to the world, is keeping that startup magic at any scale. That's super powerful.
It's all psychology, which is why it hasn't been solved yet, right? Like jobs to be done is a lot easier, right? It's like, okay, I know actually how to build a tool and using current technologies to do that. The psychology is cross-functional teams don't spend enough time together. All the rituals, everything is down functional lines. And now throw in hybrid work or others is, maybe you haven't built the relationship yet. You haven't built the trust. You haven't built the thing, And so a lot of what we're doing is solving psychological problems. Like, how do you actually get that junior engineer to participate and give their feedback, even though they're incredibly introverted and there's power structures involved, right?
Yeah.
But we know that person has the unlock, and they can participate very early on, not when they get the Jira ticket, but in the ideation phases. Then that's when the magic happens, right? And I think that's the key, is like this inclusivity and getting people to feel comfortable to participate is about, the UX design. Frankly, it's the cost structures to make sure that you even have a seat at the table, because SaaS tools are seat-based pricing. And then it's ultimately, or culture, right? And so, that's a lot of why, it hasn't been cracked yet.
That's super powerful. So just like we were talking about before, how a customer won't want to speak their mind if the design is too fully baked. The engineer won't feel free to speak their mind if the spec is too fully baked.
Yep, that's right.
So if you get people into that sketchy space, that preliminary space, they're more likely to give their feedback and their input.
Yeah. And, all the way down to the UX of the tool they're using itself, right? If you're coming into a functional tool, a specialized tool, even if it has collaboration unlocks, the psychology of somebody coming into, you're the visitor, you're the guest at the house of the designer, you're not going to give great feedback. You're not even going to want to touch the house because it's too minimalist and too nice, So, like, there has to be this idea of, this entire platform was built for me too. And I'm now I'm not scared to draw on it. I'm not scared to drop a sticky. I'm not scared to move objects around it. Like, when we fail, when somebody comes in, they're like, my only job is to look at it and maybe add a comment. It's like, nope, we need you to create, be a co-creator.
Play in that sketchy space.
Yeah,
that's right. That creativity. That's incredible. Well, I think we have to wrap it up here. Thank you so much for your time, Jeff. It's been really a pleasure speaking with you today.
Awesome. Thanks, Eric. I appreciate it.
All right. Have a wonderful day.